The millionaire visited the school he frequently supported to check on things. A frequently isolated boy caught his attention. This boy regularly walked into the nearby woods alone. Until one day, the millionaire decided to follow, and when he discovered what the boy was doing in the forest, he was instantly alarmed and dialed 911. Pine Ridge welcomed Grant Hollis with a tranquility New York City never offered, yet for Grant this quiet could sometimes be more unnerving than a siren blast. He sat in his SUV parked a distance from the gate of Pine Ridge Elementary, his fingers lightly tapping the steering wheel. He wasn't there for a pickup. He came simply to observe the school for which he had just signed a check to fund a new library. Or perhaps he was there to seek out a reflection of himself from 30 years ago. The kids poured out of the gate like bees from a burst hive. There was the commotion of laughter and excited shouts, but Grant's gaze fixed on a single spot, a boy completely separate from the surge of students. Liam Parker. A child from a tough background that Grant had incidentally discovered. The boy didn't run, didn't yell. He stood pressed against the brick wall, his eyes scanning the surroundings with the vigilance of a seasoned watchman rather than a 7-year-old kid. That look went straight through to Grant's memory. It was the look of children who grew up navigating the foster care system, kids who constantly had to ask themselves, "Where will I be sleeping tonight? Who will be the one who gives me grief?" Grant had that look before he walked away from his own sister over meaningless wills and property disagreements. Grant narrowed his eyes. Instead of lining up for the bright yellow school bus, Liam backed away. The boy slipped through a narrow gap in the rusted iron fence at the rear of the playground, quick and decisive. On the first day, Grant just watched from his vehicle. He saw Liam head straight toward the pine woods, following the path of a dried-up creek bed. The small figure's solitude was so profound that Grant felt a knot tighten in his chest. On the second day, Grant decided to get out of the SUV. He maintained a wide distance, taking cover behind the trees. Liam wasn't just taking a stroll. He pulled out a worn compass and a plastic whistle hanging from a leaf-shaped keychain from his pocket. He placed the compass on his palm, turned to set his bearing, and then started walking. "What in the blazes is this kid up to?" Grant mumbled, unconsciously touching his phone. By the third day, curiosity had morphed into a genuine concern. Grant ventured deeper into the woods. He saw Liam stop in front of an old oak tree. On the gnarled trunk was a fresh inscription that had already begun to darken, LP plus DP. Liam lowered his backpack. He took out a plastic bag and began to pick up candy wrappers and plastic bottles around the base of the tree, placing them in the bag. The action was practiced like a solemn ritual. After tidying up, Liam knelt, reaching his hand into a deep tree hollow. He pulled out a small gray-taped tin box. Liam opened the box. He flipped through the scraps of paper inside, his eyes glued to them, his lips moving as if reciting a chant. Then he closed the lid, returned it to the hollow, and covered it with dry leaves for camouflage. The phone in Grant's jacket pocket vibrated. He flinched, retreating behind a large fern. The screen showed his assistant's name. Grant answered, his voice low and quick. "I hear you. Mr. Hollis, the school board needs to confirm the library fund disbursement. They asked if you could come sign the papers tomorrow afternoon. Principal Lane is really looking forward to it." Grant watched Liam's small back as he meticulously rearranged the dry leaves. He remembered his sister. If he had cared about what she was stowing away in the old shoebox under her bed, instead of the numbers in his bank account, perhaps he wouldn't be having dinner alone now. "The library funds can wait, Sarah. The figures aren't going anywhere." But Sir Ms. Lane mentioned, "Tell her to hold on. I'm tied up right now." Grant hung up. He raised his phone, snapping photos of the oak tree and the trail leading in. He needed to document these coordinates. Kids like Liam don't build secret forts for fun. They establish safe havens, and a safe haven only appears when they feel the outside world is unsettling. Suddenly, Grant saw a shadowy figure dart through the opposite edge of the forest. He squinted for a closer look, but the person disappeared behind the thick pines. A chill ran down his spine. Liam wasn't alone in these woods. Day 4. Grant arrived earlier. He took up his position in the same spot, but today Liam didn't follow the familiar route. As soon as he slipped through the fence, the boy didn't pull out the compass. He gripped his backpack straps tightly, his head down, taking a sharp turn onto a narrow, less-traveled side path. Liam's footsteps were rapid, hurried. Grant clicked his tongue, shoving his phone into his pocket. He couldn't sit back and observe anymore. Liam's protocol had been breached, and his gut told him that this child's game had just come to a close. Grant stepped out of the brush, pushed the branches aside, and pursued the small sneakers that were quickly vanishing around the bend. Grant forcefully pushed aside the fern fronds that were whipping his face, disregarding the small stinging scratch on his cheek. He had to move faster. Liam's small form darted in and out of sight ahead like a squirrel evading a predator. The boy was no longer walking, he was running. Grant pressed himself against a large pine tree when Liam abruptly stopped. In front of them was a clearing where the trail widened slightly enough for a large vehicle to fit. And there it was. A bulky gray van was parked conspicuously among the weeds. The paint was dull, coated with dry mud, the tinted windows concealing everything inside. The side sliding door was slightly ajar. Grant held his breath, pulling out his phone. Instinct told him this was not a normal student pickup. No parent would meet a child in such a secluded spot a mile of woodland away from the school gate. A man stepped out of the vehicle. He was wearing jeans and a plain black t-shirt, no school logo, no staff badge. He didn't approach Liam. He stood leaning against the van door, arms crossed, his posture nonchalant as if waiting for a delivery. He raised his hand and gave 2 slight waves. A command. Liam froze in place. His small hand was tightly clutching the plastic whistle hanging from his neck. Grant narrowed his eyes, waiting for the whistle to sound, a signal of distress, a call for aid. But the space remained absolutely silent. Liam didn't blow the whistle. He was terrified. "Come on over, little hero," the man said. His voice wasn't loud, but echoed in the quiet clearing. "I don't have all day." Liam swallowed, taking timid steps toward the vehicle. His eyes constantly darted around as if fearful someone would see, yet also hoping someone would. The man reached into his pants pocket, pulling out a thin white envelope and a blue plastic card. He didn't hand them over immediately. He held them out, waiting for Liam to fully step into the vehicle's shade. "Well done. Your dad will be thrilled." Grant felt his blood rush to his face. He was referring to the boy's father who had passed away. A cruel manipulation. Liam reached out, snatching the envelope and the card. The very moment the man gave a smirking smile, one without any warmth in his eyes, Grant hit the capture button. Grant took 3 photos in quick succession. One capturing the license plate clearly, one focusing on the man's face, and the final one showing Liam receiving the envelope. He backed away, stepping lightly on the decaying leaf litter to avoid making a sound, then slid his finger across the phone screen. The 911 call connected instantly. "Pine Ridge Police. How can I help you? I need a patrol unit dispatched to the woods behind the elementary school." Immediately, Grant said, his voice clipped, trying to keep the volume as low as audible. "There are signs of child enticement. A gray van, Oregon plate, 4H2-990. Please confirm your exact location. I'm about 200 yards west of the main trail. I've sent the coordinates via GPS. The best entrance is from the turn near the old mile marker number 4 sign. I have photographic landmarks if you need them. We have identified the location. Units are en route. Please maintain a safe distance." The sound of the van's engine revving cut the call short. Grant looked up sharply. The man had gotten into the vehicle, slamming the door shut. The van surged forward, its tires crushing the weeds before speeding away. Liam jumped. He backed away too quickly, his heel catching on an exposed pine root. He tumbled backward. The envelope was still clutched tightly in his hand, but the plastic card flew out, falling onto the dry leaves. Liam scrambled back up. He intended to pick up the card, but the distant sound of a siren made him panic. His eyes wide with fear, Liam turned and bolted in the opposite direction, leaving the card lying alone on the ground. Grant couldn't wait any longer. He burst out of the fern thicket. "Liam, stop right there." The boy let out a choked cry, pumping his legs even faster. But the short strides of a 7-year-old couldn't outmatch the long stride of a grown man. Grant caught up to him after only a few dozen yards. He didn't grab his arm or shoulder, afraid of scaring the boy further. He ran ahead, blocking his path. Liam braked suddenly, skidding and falling hard to the ground. He curled up, clutching his chest with both hands. "I didn't do anything wrong, I didn't do anything wrong," Liam cried out, his voice thin with sobs. Grant raised both hands, high palms open to show he was not a threat. He knelt on one knee to bring his eyes level with the boy's. "Take a deep breath, Liam. I'm not a bad guy. I'm not with that man." Liam was still gasping for air, tears streaking his dirt-smeared face. He said, if the police knew, my dad would be sad. My dad wouldn't be at peace." Grant gritted his teeth. Anger welled up in his chest, but he suppressed it, letting out a long sigh. "Your dad wouldn't be sad that you're safe, kiddo. Listen, my name is Grant. I saw that car. I saw him hand you things." The sound of the police siren was very close now. The squeal of tires on the asphalt at the edge of the woods echoed, followed by the definitive sound of car doors opening and closing. A female officer with her hair neatly tied in a ponytail emerged from the trail. She moved quickly, her hand hovering near the utility belt holster, her eyes quickly scanning the scene. "Officer Ruiz here, who placed the 911 call." Grant stood up, maintaining his position, shielding Liam. "That would be me, Grant Hollis." The van left in the direction of the old trail leading to the highway. "About 3 minutes ago." Elena Ruiz nodded, gesturing to her partner to follow the direction Grant indicated while she approached. She looked at Liam, who was huddled on the ground, then at Grant with a measured, scrutinizing gaze. "Is the boy okay?" "Shaken, but no external injuries," Grant replied concisely. He stepped back toward where Liam had fallen, his eyes fixed on the ground. Amidst the dull brown pine needles, a small piece of blue plastic stood out. Grant bent down to pick it up. It was the card Liam had dropped. It bore a stylized mountain logo with the words North Ridge Youth Outreach, Junior Scouts. Below that was a member ID number, but the name section was blank. He turned and held out the card to Elena. "I think you should look at this, and this too." Grant held out his phone, already displaying the photo of the license plate. He was waiting for the boy. This wasn't a random encounter. Elena took the card, flipping it over. She frowned. This organization often provides community support at the school, but they don't have any nature outings scheduled for this time. She walked toward the deep tire tracks in the damp soil, pulling out her radio to call in the license plate for verification. Grant turned back to Liam. The boy had gotten up, leaning his back against the pine trunk. He was trying to zip his jacket all the way up, covering his neck. His hand was firmly holding something bulging beneath his jacket, right against his chest. Grant knew what it was. The envelope. He caught Liam's eye. The boy looked at him, then at the female officer, his eyes pleading. "Don't say anything." That look was saying, "Don't tell her." Grant remained silent. He watched Elena busy taking measurements of the tire tracks, then looked back at the trembling child protecting his secret. If he exposed it now, the police would search and seize that envelope. Theoretically, that would be the right thing to do. But seeing the way Liam clung to it like a life raft, Grant understood that if he did that, he would shatter the last fragile trust this child had left in adults. "Mr. Hollis," Elena called without looking up. "Did you see them exchange anything, cash or an item?" Grant looked at Liam again. The boy held his breath, waiting. "A card." Grant said, his voice surprisingly even. He handed the boy the card. "I just gave you. I was quite far away and the trees obscured my view, so that's all I saw." Liam's shoulders slumped. He let out a rush of breath, a sigh of relief so audible that Grant could hear it. But Grant knew this was just the beginning. What was in that envelope that would make a 7-year-old willing to run from the police to protect? He walked closer to Liam, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder, feeling the small body still quivering in small spasms. "All right, Liam," he said softly, just loud enough for the two of them to hear. "We'll check in later, but for now let's go home. Your mom must be worried sick." Elena Ruiz wasn't the type of officer easily deterred by a man's silence or a child's pleading eyes. She stepped right in front of Liam, her hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder, but with enough firmness to keep him from moving. "Hold on a minute." Grant stiffened. He had tried to give Liam an out, but Elena was a step ahead of him. She pointed to the unusual bulge in Liam's jacket. "What are you concealing in there? Let me see." Liam backed away, his back hitting the rough pine trunk. He shook his head violently, both hands clutching his chest as if guarding a vulnerable heart. "No, it's mine. Dad gave it to me." Grant frowned. Dad gave it to him. Daniel Parker had passed a year ago. Elena knelt on one knee. She didn't try to grab the envelope, but looked straight into Liam's eyes. Her voice softened, no longer as sharp as before, but still carrying the weight of authority. "Liam, Daniel's gone. I was there at the scene that night. I knew your dad, and I know your dad wouldn't want his son taking things from strangers in the woods like this." The statement struck the child's most vulnerable spot. Liam burst into tears, the raw, gut-wrenching sobs of a child who had bottled up his feelings for too long. He slowly let go, pulling the crumpled envelope from inside his jacket and handing it to Elena. "I just wanted to help. Dad said if I followed the map right, I'd get a token of appreciation to help Mom feel better. I want Mom to stop feeling blue." Grant felt his chest tighten. He looked over at Elena. The female officer opened the envelope. Inside were a few low-denomination bills and a folded piece of paper. She skimmed it, her face hardening with anger. She folded it up and tucked it into her uniform pocket. "We're going to your house. Right now." The Parker family home was located at the end of a quiet street, painted a faded beige with a slightly sagging porch roof. The front lawn grass grew past the ankles, a typical sign of a family lacking a male figure, or one where the remaining adult was too exhausted to care about appearances. The door opened before Elena could knock. A woman rushed out. Marissa Parker. She wore a wrinkled light blue nurse's uniform, a few strands of hair escaping her hastily tied bun. Dark circles under her eyes spoke of endless night shifts. "Liam." Marissa dropped to her knees right on the doorstep, embracing her son. She checked his body, examining every scratch and smudge on his clothes. "Oh my goodness, the police called me. They said you were wandering off. What were you doing in the woods, Liam? I thought you were at your after-school class." Liam hung his head, not daring to look at his mother. "I'm sorry." "Take a deep breath," Elena interjected. "The boy is fine. But we need to talk. About the people he was meeting." Meeting who? Marissa looked up, bewildered. "Let's step inside. No need to draw the neighbors' attention." A man's voice came from behind the screen door. Derek Vaughn stepped out. He was wearing a smoothly ironed white shirt neatly tucked into black slacks. Derek glanced at Elena, then lingered on Grant with an annoyed, skeptical look. "Thank you for seeing him home." Derek said, his voice smooth but distant. "We can take it from here." The boy was just out playing. He reached out to pull Liam inside. "Into your room now, Liam." Elena blocked the doorway. "Not so fast, Mr. Vaughn. This is an alleged child enticement incident. I need to take a statement from the guardian." Derek frowned, his social smile completely gone. "Enticement. Don't make such a fuss, officer. The boy probably just followed some squirrels." He was waiting for the boy. Grant spoke up. He stepped onto the porch, standing beside Elena. His presence, a large man with an air of authority, made Derek take a step back. A gray van. He handed Liam cash and a membership card. Grant maneuvered past Derek to step into the living room. He didn't wait for an invitation. He needed to observe this child's living environment. The living room was cluttered with empty pizza boxes and piles of unfolded laundry. But on the kitchen table, amidst a stack of unpaid utility bills, a brightly colored flyer caught Grant's eye. He picked it up. The familiar stylized mountain logo. North Ridge Youth Outreach, building your child's future. "Where did this flyer come from?" Grant asked, holding the paper up high. Marissa stood up, guiding Liam to the sofa. She looked at the paper, her face worn with fatigue. Derek brought it home. He said it was an outdoor scholarship program. They would help cover educational costs if Liam participated in their training activities. "And you signed him up?" Elena asked quickly. Derek said he took care of the paperwork." "I just signed." Marissa looked at her boyfriend, confused. "What's wrong, honey? You said they were a reputable organization?" Derek glared at Grant, snatching the flyer from his hand. "Hey, this is my house. Who are you to rummage through my belongings? I'm the person who saw your girlfriend's son receive things from the man driving this organization's van in the woods," Grant retorted, his voice calm but firm. And I find it strange that you seem reluctant to know who your child was meeting. Elena pulled out her notebook. She looked directly at Derek. That van is registered to North Ridge. This organization is currently under investigation for suspicious fundraising activities, Mr. Vaughn. And more importantly, why was Liam walking in the woods? Didn't you tell the school you picked him up? Marissa turned sharply to look at Derek. The blind trust in her eyes began to crack. Derek, you told me you picked him up every day. You said Liam liked to play late in the schoolyard. Derek clicked his tongue, his face clearly showing his annoyance at being cornered. He waved his hand dismissively. What's gotten into you, Marissa? You know I'm busy with work. The boy's getting older. He needs to be self-sufficient. What's wrong with a little walk? I just wanted to harden him up a bit. Toughening him up by letting him walk into the woods to meet strangers, Grant delivered the final blow. Enough, Derek yelled. He pointed toward the door. I'm asking you to leave my house. I'll call my lawyer if you continue to harass us. Liam, into your room now. Liam, who had been sitting absolutely still on the sofa, suddenly jumped up. He didn't run into his room as Derek instructed. He darted into his bedroom, his feet thudding on the old wooden floor. Liam, Marissa called after him. Less than 10 seconds later, the boy returned. In his hands, he held a tin box. It looked identical to the box Grant had seen at the oak tree. The lid featured faded images of toy soldiers. But the lid had been pried open. The edges of the tin were warped and jagged. Liam ran up to his mother, turning the box upside down. Nothing fell out. It was empty. It's gone. Mom, Liam cried out, tears welling up again. Dad's letter. I hid it under the bed. Someone made off with it. Marissa looked at the empty box, then slowly raised her eyes to look at Derek. Derek stood there, his face slightly pale, but trying to maintain his composure. He shoved both hands into his pants pockets, shrugging slightly. What's the big deal about that trashy old box? You probably just dropped it somewhere. No, Liam wailed. You took it. You were the only one home when I was at school. You took Dad's letter. The atmosphere in the room thickened. Grant saw Marissa's hands clench into fists, shaking uncontrollably. Elena stepped forward, placing herself between Derek and the mother and son. Mr. Vaughn, she said, her voice cold. I think we need to have a clearer conversation about your whereabouts today. Derek scoffed. He looked at his watch. I have nothing to say. And unless you have a search warrant, you have no right to detain me here. He turned his back and headed straight for the back door leading to the garage. Grant started to follow, but Elena raised a hand to stop him. She shook her head subtly. They didn't have enough evidence to make an arrest right now. If they pushed too hard, he would claim trespassing. The back door slammed shut. The sound of Derek's sports car engine roared and then faded into the distance. Marissa collapsed onto the sofa, burying her face in her hands. Liam hugged his mother's neck, the empty tin box rolling on the floor like a silent witness to the unraveling that had just occurred. Grant bent down and picked up the box. He ran his finger over the fresh scratch on the lid. It had been opened with a sharp object, perhaps a knife or a screwdriver. The person who did it didn't care about preserving a keepsake. They only cared about what was inside. Liam, Grant asked, his voice low and warm. What was in that box, besides your dad's letter? Liam sniffled, lifting his red-rimmed eyes to look at him. A key. A tiny, yellow key. Dad told me if anything happened to give it to Aunt Naomi. But Aunt Naomi went away. Grant looked at Elena. Both understood immediately. Derek had taken the key, and he had just left. He didn't flee out of fear. He fled to the place where that key belonged. We have to go, Grant said, standing up sharply. Right now. Derek Vaughn had taken the safe key. But what had he actually managed to get his hands on? Did that empty box contain another clue, or had Daniel Parker predicted this and set an even larger trap? Please continue listening to the story with us. Elena's patrol car screeched to a stop in front of the Pine Ridge Elementary School gate. Grant checked the clock on the dashboard. It was nearly 9 in the evening. The school was shrouded in darkness with only a few security lights casting a pale yellow glow onto the empty playground. Elena turned off the engine and turned to the back seat. Principal Lane is waiting in her office. We need to do this quickly. Marissa, are you okay? Marissa was huddled in the corner of the seat, still gripping Liam's small hand. Her eyes were puffy, but they no longer held the vague, sleepy look of endless night shifts. Derek's strange behavior had roused her painfully. "I'm fine. I need to know why my son was able to leave the school without anyone knowing." The group walked quickly through the silent corridor. Their footsteps echoed on the tile floor. Grant walked last, his eyes scanning the students' messy drawings taped to the walls, a place that should have been absolutely secure. The principal's office door was open. Cynthia Lane stood next to her large oak desk. She was a woman in her 50s, hair in a tight bun, always presenting a strictly immaculate appearance. But tonight, her suit was slightly rumpled, and her finger nervously tapped a rhythm on the desk surface. Officer Ruiz Ms. Lane nodded in greeting her voice, trying to maintain calm, but her eyes wavering when she saw Grant. "And Mr. Hollis. I didn't expect the school's largest benefactor to visit at this hour." Grant didn't beat around the bush. He pulled out a chair for Marissa, then stood arms crossed, leaning against a filing cabinet. "We're not here for a visit, Ms. Lane. We're here to review the security camera footage, the back gate, the past 2 weeks." Ms. Lane frowned, looking to Elena for confirmation. "I've received the police request, but I must emphasize the school's protocol is very strict. The gate supervisor checks off every student onto the bus or hands them directly to a parent. Then, how could Liam Parker walk into the woods alone for 4 straight days?" Marissa spoke up. Her voice was hoarse but resolute. The principal stiffened. She turned to her computer, her fingers flying over the keyboard. A large screen on the wall lit up, divided into small squares, showing different camera angles. "Let's look at the dismissal time. 3:15 p.m., Elena requested. The video played. The schoolyard was noisy and bustling. Grant narrowed his eyes, focusing on the camera angle of the back gate. The second day of last week. A crowd of students rushed out. Liam stood in the corner near the pillar, backpack on, eyes fixed on the street. 3:30 p.m. The schoolyard began to empty. A black sports car drove past but did not stop. That was Derek's car. He was late, Grant said. He intentionally drove past and kept going. 3:45 p.m. In the video, Liam was still standing there. The gate supervisor, a young female teacher, was busy talking to another parent across the way. Liam looked around, then very quickly backed up, slipping through the gap in the bent iron fence. No one saw him. No one stopped him. Ms. Lane's face turned ashen. She quickly forwarded to the next day. The scenario repeated exactly. Derek didn't show up, or he showed up very late, by which time Liam had vanished into the woods. I don't understand, Ms. Lane stammered. The supervisor reported that he was picked up. We saw his stepfather's car parked there. He's not his stepfather, Marissa cut in. She glared at the screen where her son was slinking away alone through the cold iron fence, and he didn't pick him up. He let him go on his own. Grant moved away from his spot, approaching the principal's desk. His eyes landed on a neat stack of files in the corner. On the file folder cover was the familiar logo, a stylized blue mountain. North Ridge Youth Outreach. He picked up the file. Ms. Lane started to raise her hand to stop him, but drew it back when she saw Elena's sharp glance. "What is this organization doing here?" Grant asked, flipping open the first page. They are a new associate," Ms. Lane explained, her voice weak. "Madison Reed. The organization's director offered a scholarship for students from challenging backgrounds, orphans, single-parent families. They said they wanted to help the children learn discipline." Grant quickly scanned the list. Liam's name was on the third line highlighted. Next to it was a note, insurance confirmed. "Guardian Cooperative. You call selling student information an association." Grant slammed the file onto the desk. "No. We didn't sell anything," Ms. Lane protested. "They donated gifts, organized free outings. The parents all signed the consent form." Elena took the application form with Liam's name on it. She quickly read through the fine print on the back. Her eyebrows knitted tightly. "Marissa, did you read this before you signed?" Marissa shook her head, clutching her forehead. "Derek gave it to me in the morning, right after I got off the night shift. He said it was just a consent form for a field trip needed to be signed quickly to secure a spot. I was too exhausted." "Clause 4.2, Elena read aloud. In the event of prolonged activities or an emergency medical situation, the organization reserves the right to act as temporary guardian to handle financial and insurance procedures without the need for family confirmation. The room fell absolutely silent. The computer's cooling fan whirred like a buzzing bee. "What does that mean?" Marissa asked, her voice trembling with fear. "It means they don't need to abduct Liam," Grant said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "They just need to stage a minor incident or take the boy away for a bit. That signature allows them access to the trust fund, the medical insurance money, everything under the guise of temporary guardian." Marissa covered her mouth, stifling a sob. Grant pulled out his phone. "Rachel," he said as soon as the other line picked up, "I need you in Pine Ridge now. Bring all necessary documents to freeze a guardianship file. I'll send the address." He hung up and turned to Ms. Lane. "I want all these files sealed. Not a single sheet of paper is to leave this office until my lawyer arrives." "But Ms. Reed won't be pleased." Ms. Lane tried to salvage her last bit of authority. "She's a respected member of the community." "Respected?" Grant scoffed. "You just enabled a fraud scheme, Cynthia. If I were you, I'd worry about my job before worrying about Madison Reed's satisfaction." Suddenly, the office landline rang. The piercing sound tore through the tense atmosphere. Everyone flinched. Ms. Lane looked at the caller ID screen. Her face turned from pale white to gray. "It's her," she whispered. "Madison Reed." Grant signaled for Ms. Lane to answer, put it on speaker, and act normal. The principal shakily picked up the receiver, her fingers fumbling with the speaker button. "Hello, Cynthia speaking." "Hello, Cynthia. Sorry to call so late." A woman's voice rang out, sweet and sophisticated, yet containing a hint of urgency. "I'm reviewing the list for tomorrow's event. Is Liam Parker's file complete? Our insurance side needs to confirm the boy's special code tonight." Special code. That was the card Liam dropped in the woods. Marissa started to shout, but Elena quickly placed a hand on her shoulder, signaling her to be quiet. Yes," Ms. Lane said, looking at Grant for help. "His mother signed it, but I haven't had a chance to send the scan." "Oh, no worries." Madison's voice became slightly sharper. "Derek said he got that important key. We'll take care of the rest. You just make sure there are no issues at the school tomorrow." "I heard the police were there today." Grant clenched his hand into a fist. Derek had the key. He took it from the tin box at the house. "Just a routine check," Ms. Lane lied, sweat beading on her forehead. "Good. See you tomorrow then. Remember, Cynthia, the library donation depends on this cooperation." A long tone sounded. The call ended. Grant looked at the inanimate desk phone. Madison Reed thought she had won. She had the signature, the key, and the cooperation of this weak system. "He has the key now," Liam mumbled. The boy who had been sitting still as a statue now looked up. "But he doesn't know the map." Grant snapped his head toward the boy. "What map, Liam?" "In the box at the base of the tree," Liam said. "Dad left the key at home, but he left the map and the secret code in the box under the oak. The box you saw." A glimmer of hope sparked in Grant's mind. The morning sun cast a pale yellow light through the window of Grant's temporary office, located on the second floor of an old brick building in the center of town. The air in the room was thick with the smell of black coffee and the rustle of papers. Grant stood leaning against the window, looking down at the quiet street below, while Rachel Kim, his private lawyer who had flown in from Seattle, reviewed a thick stack of files on the desk. Rachel tapped the end of her pen on the wooden desk, breaking the silence. She was a woman of quick and efficient demeanor. "Grant, look at this." Daniel Parker didn't just leave behind a rundown house. Marissa sat opposite her, hands tightly clasped. She looked at Rachel with a mix of fear and hope. Liam sat beside his mother, his legs swinging without touching the floor, his eyes fixed on a glass model building on Grant's bookshelf. "What is it, Counselor?" Grant walked closer. "An education trust fund." Rachel pushed a paper forward. "Not a huge amount, about $50,000. Daniel saved it from his old workers' disability benefits, but the problem is, it's been frozen." "Why?" Marissa asked, her voice faltering. "Daniel never told me about this money, because there's a dispute over the guardian's signature," Rachel explained, her voice sharp. The bank received a request to transfer management to a third party 2 weeks ago. They suspected a forged signature, so they temporarily put a hold on it. And the person requesting the transfer is none other than Derek Vaughn, acting as the authorized representative. Marissa covered her mouth. She recalled the papers Derek had given her to sign while she was in a daze after her night shift. He said they were for house repairs, car insurance. He never mentioned Daniel's money. He wants Liam's college fund. Grant said, his voice low. That's why he needed the key. Liam suddenly spoke up, his childlike voice, clear but containing an unnatural maturity. Dad didn't trust Mr. Derek. Dad said he smiled a lot, but his eyes didn't. Grant turned toward the child. He sat down in the chair next to Liam. Liam, yesterday you mentioned Aunt Naomi. Who is she? Liam looked at his mother, then at Grant. She's Dad's sister. Dad said if he was away for a long time, Aunt Naomi would come visit me. But since Dad passed, Mr. Derek said Aunt Naomi hated Mom and me. He made her leave. Marissa burst into tears. She buried her face in her hands on the table. Derek said she wanted to take the house. He said she criticized me for being a poor nurse who couldn't raise a child. I believed him. I blocked her number. It's not your fault you misplaced your trust, Marissa, Grant said firmly. Derek isolated you. That's how manipulators operate. He cuts off all sources of support so you only cling to him. The office door opened. Elena stepped in holding a thin but important file. She nodded to Rachel and got straight to the point. I just checked Madison Reed's bank transactions. There was a large deposit from an anonymous account into the North Ridge Fund this morning. And guess whose source account it belongs to? Derek. Grant guessed immediately. Exactly. But it's not his money. He pawned his sports car and took out a large high-interest loan. He's buying that guardianship seat from Madison. He needs Liam's trust fund to pay off his debts and maintain that phony fancy lifestyle. All the pieces fell into place. Derek had no genuine affection for Marissa or Liam. He was drowning in debt and saw the mother and son as a walking ATM. We need proof, Rachel said, her eyes lighting up with the fierce look of a good lawyer. I can block the money transfer, but to force him out of the boy's life and press charges against Madison, we need to prove he intended fraud from the start. The mailbox. Grant stood up. He looked at Liam. You said there was another box at the oak tree, right? The one with the map. Liam nodded strongly. Yes, Dad hid it very well. He called it his insurance policy. We have to go there, Grant ordered. He opened a drawer, taking out a few small GPS trackers and a professional voice recorder. Derek has the key, but he won't know how to use it without the map. He'll figure that out soon. Grant handed Marissa a tiny lapel recorder. Clip this on. If we run into him, I want to record every word he says. You think he'll be there? Elena asked, checking the sidearm on her hip. As a police officer, she was accompanying them to ensure everything collected was admissible in court. He's desperate, Elena, and a desperate person often returns to the starting point. Grant's SUV glided smoothly down the dirt road leading to the edge of the woods. He didn't take the main road, but circled around an old trail behind an abandoned campground to avoid drawing attention. Grant stopped the car about 100 meters from the woods. Everyone got out in silence. The pine woods looked gentler during the day, but its quietness still made one feel uneasy. Grant led the way with Elena covering the rear. Marissa held Liam's hand, walking in the middle. They followed the trail that Grant had memorized from the photos he took a few days prior. Birds chirped high above, but Grant paid no mind. His eyes constantly scanned the dense bushes. He could feel Marissa's tension. Her hand was ice cold when it accidentally brushed his as they stepped over a large root. Are we close? Liam, Grant whispered. Just past that big rock, we're there. Liam pointed forward. They walked a few more minutes. The scent of pine resin was strong in the air. Grant raised his hand to signal them to stop. He heard a noise, not the wind. The sound of metal hitting rock and dirt, clang, rustle. Grant signaled for everyone to take cover behind a large fern bush. He slowly peered over. At the old oak tree with LP plus DP carved into it, a black sports car was parked askew on the weeds. The car door was wide open. Derek Vaughn was there. He no longer had his usual polished look. His white shirt sleeves were rolled up, stained with mud. Sweat was beading on his forehead, matting his hair. He was holding a short-handled camping shovel, frantically digging around the base of the tree. Confound it! It has to be here. Derek swore, swinging the shovel hard at the tree root. That old fool, where did you hide the darn thing? He had realized that the number 18 key was useless if he didn't know which bank it belonged to and what the secondary code was. He was back to find the final clue. Grant looked over at Elena. She nodded softly, her hand on her radio, but not yet calling for backup. They needed to catch him in the act of taking the evidence or hear him confess his intent. Derek threw the shovel onto the ground, sinking down, exhausted. He pulled the tiny gold key from his pocket, holding it up to the sunlight, his face twisted with anger and greed. "Marissa," he muttered, his voice echoing clearly enough for Grant's recorder to pick up. "If you don't sign the rest of those papers, I'll have you and your kid living on the street." Marissa shuddered. She started to rush out, but Grant held her arm tight. "Not yet." Suddenly Derek jumped up. He stared intently at the hollow higher up the tree where Liam usually hid the first tin box. He smirked a malicious grin. He tossed the key into his pocket, picked up the shovel, and headed toward the trunk, his eyes burning. "You hit it well, Daniel, but I'm always one step ahead of you." He raised the shovel not to dig the ground, but to pry open the rough bark at a higher spot where a natural crack was cleverly camouflaged with dry moss. Grant raised his fist high, signaling everyone to hold their position. Grant stepped lightly on the thick layer of pine needles approaching the old oak tree from the downwind side. Derek was still wrestling with the shovel. He was so consumed by his greed that he didn't hear the approaching footsteps. Elena stepped out from behind the ferns. Derek Vaughn. The name rang out concisely in the quiet forest. Derek jumped the shovel, slipping from his hand and falling to the ground. He spun around, his face draining of color when he saw the female officer standing rigidly in front of him. Officer Ruiz. He stammered, his eyes darting around, looking for an escape. "What? What are you doing here?" "That's the question I should be asking you." Elena walked forward lightly, kicking the shovel out of his reach. "This area is under a police hold for an investigation." "What are you doing to this tree?" Derek swallowed hard, forcing a lopsided smile. He dusted off his clothes, trying to regain his usual smooth demeanor. "Ah, Liam." The boy was crying for his plastic soldier toy. He said he buried it here. I just wanted to be a good father figure to find it to cheer him up. Dad never interred plastic soldiers. Liam stepped out from behind Grant. The boy looked directly at Derek, his eyes no longer fearful as they were at home. Dad buried treasure. Derek's face darkened. He started to lunge toward the child, but Grant blocked his way. Grant's broad shoulders were like a solid barrier. "Stay away from the boy," Grant said, his voice deep and cold. While Elena distracted Derek by asking him for his identification, Liam tugged on Grant's sleeve. The boy led him around to the back of the oak tree, where the roots curled up to form a natural hollow out of sight. "It's here," Liam whispered. Dad called this the tree spirit's pocket. The boy reached deep into the gap between two large roots, sweeping away the mulch and decaying leaves. A rectangular object was revealed. Grant bent down, using both hands to pull it out. It wasn't a regular tin box. It was carefully wrapped in a thick military-grade canvas, sealed tight with waterproof tape. It was much heavier and more substantial than the cookie tin Liam kept at home. Grant placed the box on a flat rock. Rachel Kim approached, turning on her phone camera to record the unboxing process. Marissa stood beside her, her hands trembling as she placed them on the lid. "Open it," Marissa, Grant encouraged. "This is what Daniel left for you." Marissa peeled off the tape. The sound of the adhesive tearing was dry and crisp. She flipped open the lid. Inside was a small dark brass key with the number 18 subtly engraved on its body. Beside it was a hand-drawn map with whistle notations: "Too short turn, left when long, go straight." And at the bottom was a folded letter. Marissa picked up the letter. Her husband's familiar, slightly slanting handwriting appeared. "To Marissa and Liam. If you two are reading this, it means I'm no longer around, and my hunch about Derek was right. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner, but I needed proof. Derek is not a friend. He approached me right after I received the disability settlement. He asked too many questions about Liam's insurance and trust fund. I saw him secretly take photos of my files. This key opens safety deposit box number 18 at the Pine Ridge Community Bank. Inside are the original copy of my will and the evidence I collected about Derek conspiring with a woman named Reed to modify the beneficiary terms. Don't trust him. Don't sign anything. Find Naomi. Marissa finished reading, and the paper fell from her hand, fluttering down to the ground. She didn't cry. The pain had surpassed the limit of tears. She slowly turned back toward Derek. Derek, whose hands were now restrained by Elena, craned his neck, trying to see what was in the box. When his eyes met Marissa's, he froze. She was no longer the weak, tired woman worn out by night shifts. Marissa looked at him as if he were a disgusting creature that had just crawled out of the mud. "You said you were looking for my son's toy," Marissa asked, her voice soft but sharp as a razor. "Marissa, let me explain," Derek pleaded hurriedly. "That Daniel was delusional. You know how he was. Quiet." Marissa cut him off. She walked over, holding up the number 18 key in front of him. "My husband wasn't delusional. He just saw through your greed. You want this right, you will never get your hands on it. And don't you dare come one step closer to my son ever again." Rachel Kim quickly took photos of the letter and the key. She turned to Grant. "It's enough. This will explicitly names Naomi Parker as the alternate guardian. All the papers Derek forced Marissa to sign are void due to duress and fraud." Grant nodded. He felt a sense of partial relief. The truth was out. But just then, Elna's radio blared, shattering the brief moment of triumph. "Central, calling Officer Ruiz, Code 3 alarm. Surveillance unit reports the suspect Madison Reed's gray van just left the town parking lot, heading Pine Ridge Community Bank. She appears to be in a big hurry." Grant and Elena exchanged a look. "She's going to the bank," Grant said quickly. "She doesn't need Daniel's key. She's going to use the forged guardianship papers provided by Ms. Lane to request a forced entry into the safe deposit box. She wants to dispose of the evidence in there before we can place a lock." "Get in the car," Grant yelled hastily, shoving the documents back into the box. "We have to get there before she breaches safe deposit box number 18. Elena handcuffed Derek to the door handle of her patrol car. "You stay put here and wait for the backup team to collect you. Don't even think about running." Grant's SUV roared, tires spinning up dirt and rocks, speeding toward the town. The race was not over. The race to safe deposit box number 18 has begun. Madison Reed is rushing to eliminate the last evidence Daniel left behind. Will Grant, Marissa, and Elena make it to the bank in time, or will the key and map in the tin box forever become a buried secret? Please stay with us. Thank you for following the story to this moment. Liam and his mother's journey to find the truth needs you to remain. The traffic light turned red, but Grant didn't hit the brakes. He glanced in the rearview mirror. Elena's police car was still close behind, its signal lights spinning silently. Grant swerved into the emergency lane, and the SUV sped past, leaving the crawl of rush-hour traffic behind. In the passenger seat, lawyer Rachel Kim gripped her laptop on her lap, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "There she is," Rachel pointed. At the intersection ahead, a gray van was stuck between two delivery trucks. Madison Reed sat behind the wheel, her fingers drumming impatiently on the steering wheel. Grant stepped on the gas. The glass door of the bank appeared before them. He slammed on the brakes right in front of the main lobby. Marissa and Liam got out pale from car sickness, but their feet still moved quickly, following Grant's lead. The bank manager, a bald man with thick glasses, rushed out to greet them when he saw Grant Hollis enter. "Mr. Hollis, an honor. How may I assist you? I need to open safe deposit box number 18. "Right now," Grant said, not stopping but walking straight into the vault area. "This is Ms. Parker, the legal heir, and this is a police supervisory order." The manager looked at Elena in her police uniform, then at Grant's resolute face. He swallowed hard, not daring to ask about prior arrangements. "Of course. This way." The heavy steel door of the vault opened. The air inside was cold and dry. The manager inserted the master key into the lock of box number 18, then stepped back to make way for Marissa. Marissa held the brass key retrieved from the pine woods. Her hand trembled as she slid it into the lock. A dry click echoed. Grant pulled hard on the safe deposit box door. Inside was a thick file folder and a black USB drive nestled in an anti-static plastic pouch. Rachel Kim immediately opened her laptop and plugged in the USB drive. The screen lit up, displaying a series of folders organized by date. She clicked on the folder named Evidence. Hundreds of emails appeared. Sender Madison Reed. Recipient Derek Vaughn. Rachel read aloud a paragraph highlighted as crucial. Derek, the insurance procedure requires the child to have a diagnosed mental health issue to approve the special support package. You need to make the boy appear unstable at school. Let him wander off, isolate him. When the school confirms his odd behavior, I'll use that as grounds to transfer medical guardianship to the organization. Marissa stood frozen. She stared at the screen. The days Liam was on his own, the times he was teased by friends for being strange, all were part of Derek's scheme. He didn't just want the money. He wanted to break the child's spirit to get the money. Rachel opened another attached file. It was a copy of the trust fund statement. Balance $500,000, a life insurance policy Daniel had secretly purchased before his passing, plus his workers' compensation. $500,000. Grant said, his voice ice cold. He betrayed the boy for that price. Marissa wasn't crying anymore. She reached out to touch the screen, touching her son's name in those cold emails. The hands that had once trembled with fear were now clenched tight. She turned to look at Liam, who was clinging to Grant's leg. He didn't see my son as a person, Marissa said. Her voice was low with no hint of weakness. He saw Liam as a defective item to be liquidated. She lifted her head, looking straight at Grant. Copy everything. Don't miss a single word. I want him to pay the price for every tear Liam shed. Grant nodded. He signaled for Rachel to back up the data onto 3 different hard drives. While waiting, he scrolled to the bottom of the file list, an audio file named The Last Talk. He clicked. Daniel Parker's voice played static but clear. I know what you're doing, Derek. You tampered with my accident report. You want to embezzle my wife and son's money. Derek's scornful laughter responded. Daniel, you're on your way out. You can't take that money with you. Let me take care of Marissa. Grant turned off the player. No need to hear more. Derek's despicable motive was crystal clear. He had been planning this since Daniel was on his sickbed. Elena stepped forward, seizing the original USB as evidence. We have enough evidence to charge Derek with fraud and attempted grand larceny and Madison with organized fraud. I'll request an emergency warrant now. The radio on Elena's shoulder suddenly blared, breaking the silence in the vault. Central Calling Officer Ruiz, Alarm Code 3. Surveillance reports suspect Derek Vaughn has assaulted the escorting officer and fled the perimeter of the woods. He is operating a stolen patrol vehicle. Elena swore, grabbing her radio. Where is he going? Direction of travel. A neighbor reports someone is smashing the windows at the Parker house. He's gone back home, Elena. He's trying to force his way in. Marissa's face went white. The original papers, she gasped. Liam's passport, birth certificate. They're all in the safe at home. If he gets them and makes a clean break, he won't get far. Grant slammed the safe deposit box door shut. He turned around, walking quickly toward the exit. Because we'll intercept him. Grant's car skidded to a stop in front of the Parker house. The front door was wide open. Inside, the sound of objects crashing and paper being ripped echoed. Grant and Elena rushed in. Daniel's former home office, once a quiet sanctuary, was now a disaster area. File cabinet drawers were yanked open and papers were scattered all over the floor. Derek stood amid the mess, clutching a blue folder. He spun around when he heard footsteps. His eyes were wild, with none of his former fake polish left. "This is my house," Derek yelled, tightening his grip on the folder. "You have no right." Elena didn't say a word. She walked up to him, twisting his arm behind his back. The sharp click of the handcuffs was concise. "You lost all rights to this house a long time ago, Derek." The interrogation room at the Pine Ridge Town Police Station was cold and reeked of disinfectant. Derek sat opposite Elena, his hands cuffed to the table. He had regained his composure, or at least tried to appear so. He leaned back in his chair, wearing the expression of an aggrieved party. "I'm the victim," Derek said, looking straight into the recording camera. "Madison Reed fooled me. She said it was a scholarship program. She gave me the papers. I just gave them to Marissa to sign. I had no idea she wanted to take the money." Marissa stood behind the one-way mirror, arms crossed. She watched the man she had lived with for the past year denying all responsibility. Grant stood beside her silent. He didn't need to say anything. He let Marissa see the true nature of the man herself. "He's quite the actor," Marissa whispered. "I believed those innocent eyes." Inside the room, Elena slapped the bank statement file onto the table. "What kind of scholarship program requires a transfer of $500,000 into your account as soon as guardianship is approved?" Derek shrugged. "Management fee? I was just holding it for Liam." He turned his head to look toward the glass door, as if he knew Marissa and Liam were standing there. He changed his tone, sweet and earnest. "Liam, I know you're there. Come in here with me. Are the police officers scaring you? Uncle Derek will take you for ice cream, okay?" Liam stood beside his mother, clutching the hem of Marissa's shirt. Hearing that voice, the boy cringed. That was the voice that had ordered him into the woods. That was the voice that had forbidden him to mention his father. Derek continued his psychological attack. "Marissa, don't let them tear us apart. I did all of this for you. Let me provide for—" The interrogation room door burst open. Marissa walked in. She didn't tiptoe. She walked directly in front of Derek. Liam walked right beside her. But this time the boy didn't hide behind his mother. Marissa Derek's eyes brightened. "Tell them, honey. Tell them to let me go." Marissa placed her hand on Liam's shoulder. She stood shielding her son from the man sitting there. An invisible but solid wall was erected. "Don't use my son's name," Marissa said. "And don't ever tell me I don't know what I'm doing. I know how to safeguard my child from parasites like you." She pulled a court-stamped document which Rachel had just given her from her purse. She slammed it onto the table right in front of Derek. "This is an emergency protective order. You are not allowed near my son and me within 100 yards. No calls, no texts. You are out of our lives immediately." Derek looked at the paper, then at Marissa. He let out a scoffing laugh. "You're kicking me out. What are you going to live on? Who's going to pay the electricity bill? Who's going to fix the pipes?" Lawyer Rachel Kim walked in, placing another stack of papers on the table. "You won't be worrying about the electric bill," Derek Rachel said coolly. "You should be worrying about the $200,000 debt at the casino. We've checked your credit history. You sold out Liam not to take care of Marissa. You were afraid of having your legs broken by loan sharks." Derek's face turned ashen. He was speechless. The facade of the family man shattered completely. He was just a debt-ridden man at the end of his rope. Just then, the observation room door opened. A middle-aged woman with graying hair walked in. Aunt Naomi. Grant had called her as soon as they found the letter in the woods. Naomi looked at Marissa, her eyes welling up. "Marissa." Marissa turned, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." "I listened to him." Naomi shook her head, walking over to embrace Marissa. The family circle was reconnected. Derek sat alone in the room, watching the 3 women and 1 child standing together. He had lost. He lost not because of the police, but because he didn't understand the power of solidarity. Liam looked at Derek one last time. The boy raised the plastic whistle to his mouth. A loud, sharp whistle blasted, tearing through the suffocating air. It wasn't the fearful cry for help in the woods. It was the closing whistle of the game, a signal that the boy was safe. Derek flinched, hanging his head. He didn't dare look into the child's eyes again. Elena's radio blared loudly. Officer Ruiz Madison Reed is about to take the stage. She just accepted the ceremonial check from the Parents Association. Grant looked at his watch. "She thinks she got away with it," Grant said, adjusting his suit collar. "She thinks Derek is the only fall guy." He turned to Elena and Rachel. "Let's go. We're heading to the auditorium. It's time to expose the philanthropist." Marissa grabbed Liam's hand, turning to Grant. "Can I come along? I want her to see me." "Absolutely," Grant nodded, opening the door for them. "Today is about you and Liam. We're just the supporting cast." The Pine Ridge Town Auditorium was brightly lit with warm yellow light. Round tables draped in crisp white tablecloths were neatly arranged, adorned with fresh flowers and scented candles. A crowd of wealthy parents, local business owners, and teachers were seated, all eyes fixed on the main stage. Madison Reed stood there, radiant in a luxurious cream-colored evening gown. She held a microphone, an ever-present professional smile on her face, her other hand gesturing toward the Northridge organization's growth chart projected on the large screen. "We don't just teach children how to tie knots or pitch a tent," Madison said, her passionate voice echoing throughout the room. "We teach them life skills. Life. We turn lost children into disciplined citizens. Your support today is the safeguard for your children's future." Applause erupted. The large door at the back of the auditorium opened. No one noticed except for a few people at the back tables. Grant Hollis walked in first. His black suit blended into the elegant space, but his presence was entirely different. Following him were Elena, Rachel, and Marissa and her son. Grant didn't stop at the door. He strode directly toward the technical area in the wings of the stage. The young technician running the projector looked bewildered to see the school's biggest donor appear right next to him. "Mr. Hollis, can I help you change the input source?" Grant said, placing the black USB drive on the control board. "Right now. But Ms. Reed is currently—" "Do you want to project the truth or a lie?" Grant looked directly into the young man's eyes. "Your new library depends on this USB drive." The technician swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he plugged the USB into the connection port. On stage, Madison was still speaking enthusiastically. "And to demonstrate our success, I would like to introduce a new project for children from disadvantaged backgrounds." The large screen behind her suddenly went blank. The growth chart disappeared. The entire auditorium went silent. Madison turned around, her smile frozen. "Just a minor technical glitch," she chuckled awkwardly, waving a hand toward the technician. "Please be patient." The screen lit up again, but it wasn't a presentation slide. It was a candid photo. A gray van parked in the woods, a man handing an envelope to a 7-year-old child. The crowd began to murmur. Madison's face went white. She covered the microphone, hissing toward the wings. "Turn it off immediately." "Who is playing this trick?" Grant stepped out from the stage shadows holding another microphone. He stood center stage right next to Madison. His sudden appearance stunned everyone. "No one is turning anything off," Madison Grant said calmly. "Everyone needs to see this," he gestured. The next slide appeared. It was a screenshot of an email. The text was clearly zoomed in. "Stage a small accident for the boy. We need a medical reason to access the trust fund." The murmuring turned into gasps of shock. Suspicious eyes focused on the woman in the cream-colored dress. "This is a fabrication," Madison shrieked, her voice cracking, losing all its previous sophistication. "Who are you to undermine my reputation? Where is security?" Elena Ruiz stepped onto the stage. Her police uniform was the most definitive answer. She held up the search warrant. "Pine Ridge Police Department. We have a warrant to examine all financial records of Northridge Youth Outreach on suspicion of document fraud, forgery of signatures, and conspiracy to defraud a minor of his assets." Madison stumbled back, bumping into the podium. She looked around for allies, but the parents who had just applauded her were now looking at her like a criminal. Lawyer Rachel Kim stood up from the front row, holding a long list. She turned to the audience. "It's not just the Parker family. I have here the names of 5 other families in town. Single mothers, recent widows. All were pressured to sign the same temporary guardianship form that Ms. Reed calls a scholarship." Silence enveloped the auditorium. The people on the list began to stand up, their faces aghast. They realized they had narrowly avoided becoming victims themselves. Principal Cynthia Lane, who was huddled at the delegate table, slowly stood up. She walked onto the stage, not daring to look Madison in the eye. She went straight to the microphone. Ms. Lane faltered, then looked down at the row where Liam was sitting, clutching his mother's hand. "I was wrong. I allowed strangers access to my students because I believed in promises of funding. I apologize to you, Liam. The school failed to protect you." The principal's confession was the end for Madison Reed. She had no way to deny it. She collapsed, covering her face to hide her sheer humiliation. In the audience, Grant saw Marissa bend down and hug Liam. The boy didn't cry, nor was he afraid. He held his head high, looking up at the stage where the adults who had deceived him were being held accountable. The invisible weight he had carried for so many days had vanished. He no longer had to sneak into the woods to protect his father's legacy. At the back door of the auditorium, a figure was secretly pushing the exit door open. Derek Vaughn. He had sneaked in at some point intending to find Madison for money, but seeing the situation flip, he planned a quiet escape. But he didn't get away. 2 police officers waiting outside rushed in, handcuffing him right in front of 100 witnesses. Derek bowed his head, being led away like a cowardly thief. Grant stood on the stage watching the scene. He let out a sigh of relief. The matter was concluded. Liam was safe. He pulled out his phone. The screen lit up. His finger scrolled through his contacts, stopping at a name he hadn't called in 10 years. Naomi Hollis. Sister. He looked down at Liam, who was smiling with his mother. The boy had been brave enough to face his fear to protect his family, and he, a grown man, had been running from his past for too long. Grant took a deep breath, his thumb hovering over the call button. It was time for him to step out of his own wilderness. The afternoon sun cast a pale gold hue over the Pine Ridge schoolyard. The patrol cars had left, taking the noise and chaos with them. Now, only the quiet of a fading afternoon remained. Grant stood there watching Liam and Marissa. Naomi, Daniel's sister, was helping Marissa carefully put away Daniel's last personal belongings, Scout merit badges, an old journal, into a safe storage box. It was a slow but necessary ritual. "It's done," Marissa said, closing the lid. She looked at Naomi, offering a grateful smile. "I don't know what I would have done without you." "We're family," Naomi replied, putting an arm around her sister-in-law. "Daniel was right. You deserve a peaceful life, and Liam needs a strong circle of protection." Elena Ruiz walked up, handing Marissa a file. "The petition for a civil restraining order has been granted permanently," Elena announced. "Derek will never be allowed to approach you and your son again. And Madison Reed has been indicted on charges of asset theft. Liam's trust fund has been transferred completely under your management." Marissa held the file, pressing her palm against the papers, feeling the first sense of security after a long year of struggle. Grant didn't bail them out with cash, but with a new structure of security. He stood before Liam, pointing to a small, newly erected wooden sign next to the iron fence. "From now on, this place is called the Clean Trails Club," Grant said. "It's a genuine scout program. You'll be the one designing the route. We'll pick up litter, mark the trails, and teach other kids how to care for the place they live." Liam cheered with delight. The boy took out his whistle. Daniel's whistle was no longer a secret cry for help. Tweet. The whistle sounded sharp and definitive. It was the signal to start a new life free from hiding. Daniel's old compass became the official symbol on the club's patch, and the tin box, the vessel of the late father's secret, found a new place. Liam brought it to the school counselor's office. "I'm putting it here," Liam told the counselor. "This is the wish box. Everyone can write down what they want to say to a loved one who passed or what they're afraid of. It will be safe here." The boy had chosen to share his pain with the community. Grant looked at these changes, feeling profound relief. He walked out to the empty parking lot. He pulled out his phone. It was time to heal his own wound. He called his sister. "Liz, it's me. I was wrong. My mistake was being too afraid to open up, so I chose assets over family. Are you still angry with me?" "Of course I am," his sister's voice replied, but it was no longer cold. "But the fact that you called is a good start. Come home. I'll make your favorite dish." Grant put his phone away. The afternoon sun shone on his face, smoothing out the lines of worry. The circle was complete. A millionaire learned to open his heart, a mother learned to set boundaries, and a boy learned that his father's memory could be a guiding light, not a chain pulling him into the darkness. Grant turned back to look at Liam. The boy was holding hands with his mother and aunt, walking down the quiet road home. Liam walked straight without glancing toward the pine woods even once. He walked with confidence, knowing that from now on he would always be seen protected and never have to go it alone again. Any solitary child is a mirror reflecting the negligence of adults. Truth and justice lie not only in words but also in careful observation, the steady setting of boundaries, and the proactive mending of family cracks. Don't let fear and exhaustion turn you into an enabler of wrongdoing. Look at your child. Look at the children around you and act when the time is right. Note, The story above is completely fictional. Character names, locations, and incidents have been created for the purpose of illustrating an educational message and artistic narrative. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is purely coincidental.